Hello, career thought leaders. Good to see you all today. And today we're going to be talking about how you can prevent the challenge that happens when your clients want that cool story or that one more little thing added to their resume. And I don't know that you can prevent it entirely, but if we go through this process, we might have a better chance of being able to get them on the right page from the beginning and mitigate it better on the end when there's that thing that they just think they need to add. We've all done this, right? You're going through the client, you're wanting them to take something off of their resume, or they're really wanting to add something that you know just isn't going to add value. So here's one of the things that I see a lot of resume writers talking about, that the way they start the process is by having the client put together a master resume. I would really discourage you from doing that with clients unless you're working with them in a really big picture on their full career management. But when you're working with them on a resume for a specific goal, start with that goal in mind instead. So here's what I do at the beginning of all of my engagements with a client. I ask them to find me 3 job descriptions that they're targeting. Now, if someone's at a really senior level, it might be hard for them. That may not be the right approach. So those C-level folks, maybe one down below C-level, instead of having them find those roles that they're applying to, they're going to be pretty focused anyways. I will have them tell me about what is important to their companies that they're applying for. What's going on in the industry? What are the challenges that are happening? And you'll see that all of this is focused on the audience first. We start with the audience first. What are their challenges? What are they looking for? And that's the framework for everything that we build on. So I don't even ask my clients their top 3 accomplishments. I don't ask those questions at the beginning. I ask them to tell me about the companies that they're targeting, the job descriptions that they're targeting. And I have them send that information to me ahead of time as possible, especially if they're looking at job descriptions, because then I can go through the job descriptions and pick out the common threads and know that this is what we're going to be looking for. But if we start with that focus in mind first, it means that we're not going to be gathering a bunch of irrelevant information anyways. And that's good, right? We're starting with that focus in mind. And maybe some of you do that as well. You just jump right in, and that's the foundation for where we begin. Who are they targeting, and what is important to those individuals, to those companies? And then we can build from there and gather just the specific information that we need to speak to those pains, if you will, and to really dig in and make sure that we can prove that they have the expertise that they need to address those challenges. And I love to start there with people, especially your C-level people, because that's kind of where they live, right? They live in those strategy conversations. It's easy for them to talk about because it's not, them and tooting their own horn, et cetera. And they can talk a little bit about what's going on in the industry, what's going on in their target companies. And it gives me an incredible amount of context, because we know that the power of story lies in context. And so it gives me an immense amount of context that we can use to build the rest of their information on. Now, when they send me the job descriptions, if they are sending those ahead of time, I'll go through those and pick out some of the main topics that we want to make sure we hit. When I'm working with an executive, that's, again, not probably going to be something they're going to do. So I'll ask them, start with the organizations and the pains, and then what are the top stories, the top accomplishments that show they can address those pains? What are their best things, if you will, to address those pains? And it's usually more specific than that. So if I'm working with a sales professional in technology, they're going to tell me that one of the challenges is, differentiating from knockoff technologies or fast followers. And so I'll ask them that specific question. So how have you addressed that challenge in your current roles or in a past role? And they'll tell me that story. And this is how I build the summary. So we don't even go into the chronological work history yet. We're just focused on, these are the top 5 pains of their employers. So tell me the top 5 stories briefly that demonstrate how you connect with those companies or connect with those pains. And we go through those stories kind of quickly. They give me the highlights, and sometimes I'll kind of cut them off and say, okay, we'll get to that next. That is one of your main tools as a resume coach, if you will, at this point, is giving them that direction of, oh, okay, let's move on to this next point. I'm going to come back to that one when we get to the job where it happened. Because I know that if they give me too much detail right now, I don't have all the context and it's going to get a little bit messy. So I'll have them kind of bullet point out those 3-5 stories that really show they have that experience that their target companies are looking for. If we've got job descriptions in front of me, I'll first ask them what they see as some of the main themes. What are the job descriptions looking for? And then I'll make sure that we fill in the gaps based on my review of the job descriptions. But those points and starting there is the number one way that we keep your relevant information off the resume. It's also really important then that we have some way to gather the details that I don't want to spend my time talking about in an interview. So I do use a form if they don't have an existing resume that just gets out, those duties, if you will, because we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about that in our conversation. So this would be the number 2. So number 1 is start with the end in mind. Number 2 is do a 1-2 punch with either an existing resume or a form and a conversation. So a lot of you out there might just be using a form, and there's really nothing wrong with that. But if you're getting a lot of pushback on the back end of your resumes that either something's being left out or the person feels like it doesn't feel like them, it doesn't sound like them, it might be because you're not giving them a chance to tell their stories with you. It really has nothing to do with the writing. It's just that they didn't feel heard. And then maybe there's a little bit off in the resume, but sometimes there's even really not that much off in the resume. It's just that they didn't get that opportunity to feel heard. So to have that conversation with them, it doesn't have to be long. A lot of us like to have a long conversation, but if you're using a form as well, it can be an opportunity for you to just ask a few questions around those points, take a little bit deeper, or get some clarity. But what it does is it gives that person the opportunity to connect with you, to feel like you're listening and hearing, and oftentimes creates less pushback on the back end simply because you're building that rapport and relationship, and they feel like they can ask you a question without having to make it sound more dramatic than it is. So then on the back end of things, when you're gathering their information, again, we're just focused on what does the job entail based on either their reports up front or those job descriptions or your own knowledge about the career. And you're really just asking for them to give you that detail, that intel that you need to write those points. And then you deliver the resume. I always recommend delivering a resume that could pretty much be put out to their employers the next day. You want them to proofread it, but you don't want a whole bunch of back and forth and questions and those types of things. So I try to minimize those in my draft. I might have a few places where we could do a data point here, we can do a data point there. That's one thing that a form will do. Even if you don't use the whole form, it will help you gather that information. And then if they have something at the end that they'd like to add, here's the kicker. This is the third thing. The third step is that if they have something at the end that they'd like to have out after you complete the resume, is you either suggest what you would take off if you see something that maybe you would recommend, or you state, that sounds like good information to add. We'd have to take away this, or in order to add that, we'd have to take away something. And that gets them thinking about, hey, this is a priority. This isn't just, how much can we shove into the kitchen sink? I've got to really think about here, how am I going to prioritize the information? So we start with the end in mind. We're focused on the reader, and then we're doing a conversation. And if they need something added, we're bringing them into that process of prioritizing as appropriate. If they want to add something, we say, okay, we can add that, and this is what I'd recommend removing. or we can add that and we'd have to remove something. Kind of depends on the situation, whether I leave it open or suggest something that I might remove so that they can add that in. But I find that just starting with the end in mind really helps. And I always have, the marketing or salespeople, they kind of get it, that this is a marketing piece and we can only have so much on it. The engineers, sometimes they want to add everything in the kitchen sink, and we have to have a little bit more conversation about what's really important to those hiring managers. What technologies are really important? What challenges are they facing right now? And if we have those up front, then they can do a better job of prioritizing as well. And it's good for them, it's good for their resume. Now, just wanted to kind of hold our horses here and make sure that we're not thinking I'm talking about like getting this down to one page, because I'm not. And this is just one data point, but it is a data point, which a lot of times we have a hard time finding any data. But there is data that shows employers for experience level positions are okay with a 2-page resume. So this was a study done, 7,000 resumes, so not huge, but not tiny, that employers are 1.4 times more likely to prefer a 2-page resume over 1-page resume. And this is even when it came to an entry-level job opening. I typically go around 5 to 7 years of experience, then the person would move up to a 2-page resume, depending on the level of job that they're targeting, of course, and what makes sense for their background. But even if you have a 2-page resume, a lot of our more experienced people are still going to have to prioritize and make sure that they're being thoughtful about what's on there. And if we want to get the most relevant information read, we can't have a bunch of irrelevant information on there, because it really doesn't matter how full the pages are. If there's irrelevant information on there and the reader starts to skim that, they're going to shut down, stop reading, whatever, because they're going to assume that the rest of that information is irrelevant as well. So whether or not it matters, to that individual, if their job search is, if it's relevant or irrelevant, how much fits is irrelevant, because we want to make sure that the most relevant content gets seen, which means we can't have a bunch of irrelevant content on there. What about those third-party recruiters who want everything in the kitchen sink? So that can happen. And I would just say that if that specific recruiter wants something, we can give that to them. That is not going to be the default or something that I would want to build a strategic resume around. And I know that you know that, Laura, that that's not how we're going to build your resume. If there's a recruiter that wants more detail, we could come up, and if they're finding that that's somewhat common, we could have a long version and a short version. And the short version they use for these things, and the long version they use for these other things, so that they have it put together if they're seeing that being a common thread in their industry. But I don't know if you have a particular industry or what type of client might be seeing that, Laura. That'd be interesting. I know that sometimes engineers in certain fields can have longer resumes, and sometimes that recruiter will want more, and we've just got to figure out how to organize it in a way that it's still easy to get through. But I definitely wouldn't set that up as the default unless I was really familiar with that industry or that type of role that requires more, and that detail is worth putting on there. So you feel free to share with me what you're seeing in terms of industry there. Sometimes we get into the gigs and gaps, and that can make it hard to choose and how to put things together in a resume. So we're having a session coming up on that next week. If you have the scenarios or samples or anything that you'd like us to include in that, or questions you'd like us to answer, feel free to let me know. We're gathering up more scenarios and samples and questions that we can answer to make that really interactive and really on point. So let me come back here. Laura says, often with IT and engineering. Yes. And so if we know that field and we know they're looking for more, we can create that long version that might go to that technical recruiter, and then a shorter version that might go to some of our networking contacts or the hiring manager, or a business, business contact in that industry. IT recruiters want, yep, pages full of detail. And oftentimes then it's just how to organize it so that it's easy to get through. Executives who don't meet the minimum requirements of the job description. So I'll often have my clients go through and tell me what they match up with. And if I can see that there's something off, I will ask. So it looks like this is looking for X, and I don't see that in your resume. Can you explain to me? Because I assume that I'm missing something. They just didn't write it on their resume or whatever, because that makes it a much easier conversation. So it looks like it's asking for this. Can you tell me about how we can address that in your resume? And that helps bring those two pieces together. And if I'm not missing something and they really aren't qualified, their answer will tell me that, and we can readjust what might be the better level. Is there smaller organizations that might be a better fit to target? How can we align those two pieces together? Yeah, addendums can go into more detail on specific topics. If you're working with engineers or technology, oftentimes they might have a technology addendum or maybe a case study addendum. If they're in projects and they've got a lot of project work, they might have case studies that they could have as an addendum to their resume, and the main two-page resume just has the most important pieces, the most important projects, and then they've got an addendum that has more projects, and then they could kind of decide if they put all the pieces in chronological order and it's 4 pages, or if they've got that 2 short pages and the case studies that they've attached. I like to create some puzzle pieces that people can move around for different opportunities. And that can be a way to do that, so that they could have the one, 4-page chronological resume or a 2-page chronological resume, and then case studies that are additionally attached might be a flexible way to do that. Yeah, addendums, case studies, other ways that they can add that on. Now, remember that we're starting with what is most important to these hiring managers. What are the pains that they're feeling right now? Why do they hire someone in this role? And when we lead with all of those questions, then we can figure out what is the most important information to put on there, and then what might be the additional information that a recruiter might want, but that we're going to include on an addendum or a case study sheet or something to really build up that base of knowledge, or demonstration of knowledge, if you will. So I will usually scope out a project based on what they're looking for. And then if they say, oh, we want all these case studies or whatever, then we'll say, okay, we can write those additional case study documents, and here's the price for that. As much as you can scope it up front, of course, the better, to really be looking at that and knowledgeable about what they're looking for. If they've got a 10-page resume that they send to you, so here's, before you quote the project, I always ask the client for their salary goal. So salary goal, geographic location target, or company target, or job targets, so that can help me figure out the complexity, and then their existing resume. And Jackie, those things can give you a good idea. If this person's got a 10-page resume right now, you can guess that this is going to be a little bit more challenging of a project, and you would quote a higher price than you might for someone else based on that. I have ranges on my website for pricing, but not specific pricing, so that I can quote individuals based on the complexity of their project. And I've got a form that they send in on my website where they tell me their target salary, target role, and can upload their existing resume. And I use those things in addition to our conversation, which usually have a sales conversation with people before I would quote, a bigger package. And so I use that conversation to help me determine the price that I would put into a proposal for their services. That's a great question. So as you're looking at with the clients and the process, again, the kind of gathering everything in the kitchen sink up front can cause some of those problems. Think about how you can create a more targeted intake process, so that then you're gathering the most critical information, and you're really helping the client think about the employer's desires and needs and pains, at the beginning of the process. So then you can bring that back as a filter as you're going through towards the end of the process. And if they're not focused enough on the front end to be able to create those filters, then we can start there first with a branding or focus kind of session. Because if we don't have that focus for their resume, it's really going to be ineffective, especially today. I'll just share this one last piece of information here before we go. So I found this, it's an old thing, but Jessica Hernandez shared it again. So this is from 2016, and I'll just capture the link here and drop it into the chat. This is from 2016, and it says 63% of recruiters want the resume to be customized to their open position. That's kind of low. I wonder how they asked the question, because most people want our clients to target the resume to their role, and at the very least to the general role in the industry. If we start there first, our clients are going to be much more successful. So let's start there. Let's help them and ourselves really get that information that's most critical first, so that we don't have the kitchen sink on the resume. Pushback at the higher end of my range. I don't negotiate on my quality, so I don't negotiate on price. And that's what I will say if people push back. I'll say I'm happy to give you some referrals to other people in the industry. What I've found is that if I do discount my price, it ends up being a challenge because they didn't value what I was offering. And it's not a good fit. So I will offer them other options. And sometimes they will come back and work with me, but they know they shopped around, they talked to other people, they are more comfortable with their decision. And I'm glad to be working with them then. So I don't negotiate my quality, don't negotiate price. Happy to provide you with some referrals of other individuals who are going to be at a variety of other pay price points that they can talk to and figure out who's the best fit for them. So yeah, look forward to seeing some of you again next week. Again, if you have thoughts on challenges or situations or scenarios that we can use in our eSummit, please send those to me. We'll answer your question even if you don't come to the eSummit. And if we use your scenario or sample, you'll get a free ticket to the eSummit. And then the following week on February 11th, we're starting our Academy Certified Resume Writer course. I know we have some of you that joined us today that have already completed that or are working on it. So if you really want to improve your process and your results, that's the in-depth program that we offer that will help you do that. And we'll see you back here again next week on our Trend Tuesday. Thank you, everyone.